Marshal and Commander-in-Chief of Her Majesty's Forces, Field Marshal of the Austrian Army, Field Marshal of the Hanoverian Army, Field Marshal of the Army of the Netherlands, Marshal General of the Portuguese Army, Field Marshal of the Prussian Army, Field Marshal of the Russian Army, and Captain General of the Spanish Army.
So in November 1852, the 2 miles of the Duke of Wellington's funeral procession, which should have gone directly from Horse Guards through to St Paul's, was extended. So it ran up Constitution Hill, where this is currently stood, and past Apsley House and Wellington Arch on Hyde Park Corner. In 1852, the Wellington Arch, often known as Green Park Arch or Constitution Hill Arch, did not stand in its current location. It was moved about 200 metres in 1883, so this would have been a through road actually through the back of Buckingham Palace Gardens onto the main corner. Either side of the arch were large grandstands built to take seated capacity, of which tickets were sold to view the grand funeral procession. The carriage proceeded through the middle of the arch and then past Apsley House in its previous location. Hyde Park Corner now, from the 20th century onwards, is a home to 4 war memorials: Australia, Royal Regiment of Artillery, Machine Gun Corps and New Zealand. But there's one other memorial, an equestrian statue by Joseph Brome to the Duke of Wellington. It was about in this location that Wellington Arch originally stood, and the large bronze funeral carriage passed through. It then took a sharp right, remember it's being drawn by large dray horses, and took a right past Apsley House with the huge grandstands there. Staff from the house viewed the funeral procession, probably standing on the portico balcony where you can currently see. And this was one of the largest displays of the outpouring of grief, besides at St Paul's Cathedral itself. Here, now one of the busiest roundabouts in London, that the funeral procession wound its way, taking several hours. As stated, the grandstands were present here, selling tickets, and over 1 million people came to view the entirety of the route, which proportionally, for the country at the time, makes it one of the most viewed funerals ever, especially by a non-reigning monarch. It shows the level of adoration and outpouring of grief for the Duke of Wellington as it passed, especially through monuments rededicated for him and then his former residence at Apsley House, number 1, London.
Okay. Welcome once more, ladies and gentlemen, to the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel. Today we are back with all things Wellington, and that means Marcus Cribb is here.
Hello.
Now you may notice that especially Marcus is dressed very specially for today. I've tried to do my best, but I have kind of maybe not come to Marcus's level here, but I'm wearing a black waistcoat. But the reason for the somber attire is because today we're talking about the funeral of the Duke of Wellington. It's a very somber occasion.
It's quite
it would not be inaccurate to say that on this day, on the 18th of November, when this video will be going out, most of London would be wearing black and shades of mourning. It's very difficult and very easy at the same time to try to explain the scale of this event.
There's not many modern equivalents for a non-royal funeral of this scale. Probably for some of our viewers, they'll just about remember the Queen Mum and Lady Diana Spencer. But yeah, we've been fortunate that we haven't seen like a royal funeral of that scale for quite a while, or a state funeral that's had that level. It's up there with the footage that exists of Winston Churchill when he passed away, and it's that national focus, that national outpouring of grief. To put it in perspective, and it is impossible to know for certain, we think physically attending a funeral for the portion of the smaller population, remember you're talking like a much smaller 10, 20 million population at the time, as opposed to like 60 or 80 million today in the UK, it was probably the most attended funeral for a non-royal ever, bar the medieval era. So it was absolutely massive. Wellington had just the biggest, the most lavish funeral, and it was a national outpouring of grief that we haven't seen in our generation, probably. So, unfortunately.
I would think we probably won't see it until the much to be put off death of the reigning monarch.
I think that would probably be the next equatable scale, unfortunately, yeah. So, yeah, the Duke of Wellington had passed away at Walmer Castle quite a few months previously. And one of the biggest challenges to the funeral was that this had to be a state funeral, which means it had to be state funded. But to be state funded, it had to pass through both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And Queen Victoria actually also wanted the involvement of both chambers in the planning of the funeral. Very relevant to recent politics, Parliament was prorogued at the time. This is quite a usual procedure, and only recently has the discussion made it more controversial. So Parliament was prorogued, so it wasn't sitting, so it couldn't come back to vote on the funding, which was almost certainly going to go through, because Wellington had been a statesman after being a famous general, and had been Prime Minister, as well as many, many offices held. But it had to formally be voted, so it led to a huge delay. His body was kept down at Walmer Castle for quite a long time until both houses came back. During that time, Prince Albert had basically taken over the head of the committee that was going to be running the funeral, the head of the individuals who were forming the committee. And then eventually it was voted through. When they opened the doors, which I think was on the 9th of November, for 2 days to allow the public to view Wellington's body lying and rest down there, there was in 2 days over 10,000 people attended down at Walmer Castle, which is a small town just off Deal, between Deal and Dover, not an easy destination to get to, and that just gives an early indication of the level of interest that was there. From Walmer, once all the votes had gone through, it decided that Wellington was going to lie in state in London, in a national centric area, and so his body was arranged to move to London from there.
Yeah, I was really surprised actually to see how many people went to Walmer Castles. Between 6 and 10,000 people is really a staggering figure, and they were lined up across the beach. Wellington's body was taken from Walmer Castle, and it was taken by coach to the train station, I believe at Deal. The Lord Warden's flag was lowered, as it always was when he was alive, when he left. And his friends who were at Walmer sadly watched the coach go. And there was just a feeling of complete loss for everybody who knew him. And one wrote that they felt as if the world was no longer the same as it had been. Most of his friends, and even those people who just admired him, felt this sense of the world having changed irrevocably, because he was no longer in it. Elizabeth Longford put it that to her, it seemed to them that the world had just stopped because he died. It wasn't just his friends either, because when friends like Greville, who said he just had nothing interesting to write about. And he was a prolific writer in his journals and things like that. But when the Foreign Secretary cabled Balmoral to tell Victoria what had happened, the Duke was dead. It was just all confusion, shock and confusion, and just everybody was pronouncing that he was the greatest man the country had produced, because that was all they could do in imagining Britain without him. Just to say, my goodness, the greatest man we've ever had is gone. And one of Victoria's nieces went so far as to ask, upon hearing it, what will become of Aunt Victoria now that the Duke is dead?
It was the end of a real era. It marked the end of all that Napoleonic era, William, the Georges, and it's all gone to past. And
it was an epoch-defining moment. I think it actually changed the way people thought about time in their own lives. Now, things would happen either before or after the Duke of Wellington's funeral. That now becomes part of your experience in a very, very, very specific way. This is literally a turning point in history, a huge benchmark by which you can mark a stage in your life.
And I think we would have been aware of our generation. For one example I can think of is 9/11 attacks.
Exactly. It's that kind of. This is the kind. Weirdly enough to say, this is actually the kind of level we're talking about here.
That is the effect that they seem to think of it, not just us saying that. They knew it was changing their daily lives and the way that it would be remembered henceforth.
Mm-hmm. So the train from Deal took him to London, and he first was laid in state, and obviously in state in the hall at Chelsea Hospital amidst a great deal of, I'll use the word macabre pomp. Lots of black drapes in the hall, and I believe flags and battle honours and things like that. Now, if you thought that the crowd who came to Walmer was large, between him lying in state in London, with 260,000 people apparently saw it, with carriages backed up 2 miles from the gate of Chelsea Hospital. From the lying in state taken to his old office at Horse Guards, I believe, and that would be the starting point for the funeral procession. Now, what's interesting is that this procession, which we're going to talk about next, is the brainchild and organizational responsibility, essentially, of Prince Albert and whatever council or staff he had around him. Now, Elizabeth Longford, Wellington's probably most famous biographer, said that the nothing. What he wanted nothing to be left. No expense was to be spared, and no expense was spared, and everything was done except for acknowledging the simplicity of the man himself, because this funeral is so kind of out of keeping with the way he lived his life that many of his friends didn't like it at all.
He'd asked to be buried at Warmer in the local church.
Yeah,
St.
well,
Paul's.
like just where he said that he wanted to be buried where he died. Literally, was that it? That was it. Bury me where I drop, basically, is where I.
A shame to one level that his wishes weren't respected on that. He'd asked to be buried at the local church, I think St. Paul's, just near the castle. So it would have been a very different affair for a local parish church.
Yeah, that would have been interesting. But I think if that had happened, it would have been a much smaller funeral anyway, because his sons weren't initially happy about the state funeral. I believe Duro was opposed to it to begin with. And I think they were very uncomfortable with the level of sentiment that was being poured over their father, who they were never really close to him.
It's difficult to have a national outpouring of grief to someone who is your family member, because you're going to think very differently to a stranger in the street who is distraught at the thought of the Duke of Wellington, who's never met him and maybe just seen him in passing as he was going down in a carriage. So really, really different to someone who you grew up with or raised you. So it must have been very difficult, but they were opposed to it, and I say they kind of supported the idea of the local funeral.
Yeah, quite so. So on top of the fact that Wellington would probably never have approved the ostentatious display of his life, he also didn't like trains, which is what conveyed him to London, and he wanted to be buried in Walmer. So in many ways, this was the antithesis of everything he would have wanted. But nevertheless, just as with Winston Churchill, state funerals were a big deal and usually reserved for the royal family. And but because he was such an immense figure who almost pervaded all types of higher public life during when he was alive, there was no way that it was basically could you imagine not doing all of this for the Duke of Wellington? It was almost a political necessity to have it happen.
And people needed to have that centre. I mean, did we cover how many people came? The rest of the lying in state, they think well over 250,000 people came. And on one day alone, over 55,000 people came to attend. One of the barriers actually even broke. People were crushed and killed to view the coffin lying in state. So on the day of the funeral, his body was going to be moved between Horse Guards and St. Paul's. Now, initially, that would take you east through London as a straight route, only about a mile to St. Paul's and through Temple Bar Gate. That was not going to be possible, mostly because the number of people who wanted to attend and witness. So the route was purposely elongated to cover more of London, to allow more witnesses. And it made the people attending the funeral more viable, but also the number of people in the procession was then extended. So the funeral then became even grander. The route then actually took west up Constitution Hill to where Wellington Arch, but then Hyde Park Corner. Wellington Arch, or Constitution Hill Arch, or Green Park Arch, had many names, was actually about 200 metres, different location, almost facing Apsley House at the time. The procession went through the arch and round where they'd actually built a bandstand, dais for people to watch, invited dignitaries, because people were selling seats at their windows if you had a house nearby. Ground floor, first floor, second floor, and they went up in value to a couple of pounds. I think the highest seat sold was £5 for a second viewing, which is a lot of money for a shilling a day earners. And then it was going past Apsley House. It was being designated that it must passed Apsley House in recognition of his time living there. We'll come on to the carriage, but actually they found that the carriage was so grand in design and being built, it being so heavy, that it wasn't going to be able to be pulled by normal horses. So they found 12 draft horses that would be able to pull them, and they were going to be driven by sergeants from the Royal Regiment of Artillery. I'm always quite proud of the connection there. However, the 12 draft horses they could bring together, the only ones they could get in the time and for the strength, were brewery delivery horses. So you had these 12 magnificent beasts that were going to pull. And apparently at certain points they were recognising their routes, because these were horses that basically know they didn't need to be driven, they've done it every day of their lives. And so they would try to veer off at certain points to try to go and make their delivery at local pubs with a beer. So it must have been a bit of work for the Royal Artillery sergeants. And it then went down Piccadilly and towards the city of London to eventually reach St Paul's. Then if you want to talk about the funeral carriage there, because you recently visited Stratford, say?
Mm-hmm. I will add a bit to that as well. So these that is just so typical of some of the horses I've ridden. If you ever go pony trekking, anybody who's ever gone pony trekking when they're on holiday, these horses know where they're going.
Yeah, you don't need to steer them.
And what's really funny is that if the trek leader wants to do a slightly different route, the horses will get really grumpy about it. I was on one, I remember, and this horse just was not having any of it. He knew when he wanted to turn around, and I was having to wrestle with this guy, basically, to keep him going after the rest of the horses, because he just wanted to turn around, because he's going, okay, we should have turned around like 10 minutes ago, guys. We've just gone the wrong way. But that's a pony. This is a dray horse. This is a massive thing. This is ridiculously heavy horse. So it's
they're not used to working together in that team as well.
No. So it's really interesting how this thing actually took on a life of its own.
A coffin on a wagon, the funeral carriage is just beyond.
It's beyond anything you've ever seen before, really. I mean, it had to move very slowly because it's 18 tons, and that is to sort of explain how heavy that is. These 12 dray horses became so exhausted at one point that they had to be uncoupled from the carriage, and I believe had to be brought up to pull it the rest of the way to the cathedral. It wore out 12 dray horses whose job is to pull massive wagons every day.
And that's because you won't even notice it these days in London. But Hyde Park Corner, Wellington Arch, Apsley House sit on a hill, and that actually hill is an old valley that is being caused by the Tyburn River. Marble Arch is actually Tyburn, good rebranding. And so if you ever look along Piccadilly, you'll see that gentle slope down, and that's where now the Underground River is. So it feels quite flat in London. Basically, the middle of Piccadilly is a valley.
Mm-hmm. And also, it was apparently the weather was not great either. It was Burgos weather, as Wellington would have called it. It was grey and rainy and cold, although it brightened up towards the end of the procession. And parts of the route was quite muddy. And I think either it was at Piccadilly, it could have been Piccadilly, on Piccadilly Constitution Hill, it got stuck in the mud. Yeah. Couldn't move forwards. So this thing was actually fraught with a lot of problems. Now, it was actually kind of planned that they would encounter problems. And this is where we talk about the actual thing. It's about 21 feet long, 18 tons, made of bronze. Parts of it, I believe, are made of bronze melted down from captured French cannons. And I like to think that the amount of statues that are apparently made of French cannons captured by the Duke of Wellington should really give you an idea of how many guns he captured during his career. But For instance, the statue of Achilles is also supposedly made out of
In
mounted
Hyde Park,
French guns.
yes.
But yeah, so Prince Albert designed this monstrosity, which a lot of people thought it was a monstrosity. Although Dickens also thought it was. Charles Dickens was there. He watched it go past, and he thought it was a monstrosity as well. But the idea of it was the reason. The building of it, actually, the building of the coach is why the Victoria and Albert Museum exists today, because the body formed to oversee the making of it, which had a special name, and I don't remember it right now.
The Government Department for Practical Art.
They were the clever fellows that they were, with such a name such as that, for the Department of Practical Art, wanted this to be a piece of practical art. What does that mean? That means that Temple Bar Gate is actually much too small to allow this, which had a massive platform on top of it to support to that the coffin would rest on a pinnacle like mountain of black mourning crepe or whatever it was, and it sat on the top of this mountainous black mountain eminence, alone, tiny, dwarfed by the conveyance itself. But that is much too high to pass under Temple Bar Gate. And for this reason, the thing was made with mechanical parts that would lower it to get it under the gate. This actually worked. They did get it under. They did get it through the gate because they were able to lower it. But it was, and there's a little bit more to it, but we're not there yet. And the procession was a dazzlingly somber one, which reflected the influence the Duke had wielded in life, and representatives, as you were saying, from the major administrations that he had been part of, were there, walked the route, or were in carriages, along with guidon, banners bearing heraldic devices. And his ducal coronet,
Yes.
his marshal's batons,
All in born as well. Just
yeah.
the length of this procession. Members of his household, members of his family, and it's an incredibly long procession.
The foreign batons were carried by foreign representatives. The Earl of Anglesey was carrying something. He was there. Uxbridge from Waterloo.
Add on to that, you've got 10,000 soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
The mind boggles at trying to gather that number together today for anything short of, I think, the invasion of Iraq, 11,000. It is a huge number, and at the head of it was the rifle brigades, arms reversed, sling, so the butts kind of the rifles going up and the muzzles going down, which is a sign of somber reflection. And they were the point of honour because of their unique relationship with the Duke of Wellington during the Peninsular War and Waterloo. Not actually the Duke of Wellington's regiment, 33rd. So it's quite interesting that they were chosen because they're now synonymous, Wellington and the 95th. So they previously worked because of Sharp, but actually the connection was real as well. And even at lower levels, one of the Duke's horses was actually given a pair of the Duke's Wellington boots, and they were reversed in the stirrups.
Well, it's a very moving thing to see. A lot of people broke up seeing that very sad sight.
It's quite moving.
I think over 6 battalions of infantry, 8 regiments of cavalry at least, 17 guns, obviously marching bands. There was actually a special composite battalion which was formed by taking a man from every regiment in the army as well. Obviously, I think there must have been a contingent of sailors as well who were brought up to pull the carriage out of the mud.
And bands too.
Must have been such a spectacle.
There's parade for London, and you have military bands interspersed with others, but that's not going to be a touch on the Duke of Wellington's funeral.
No, can you imagine it? It's like there would just be the sound of these dirges. and the echoing sound of horses' hooves and slowly marching feet, and the turning of wheeled carriages, not to mention the grumbling of the machine itself. This
When you have these events normally in London these days, they are celebrations like the Queen's birthday or royal weddings, and the overwhelming sound you have is the crowd cheering. And they wouldn't have done. You would have been weeping, but they otherwise would have been deathly silent in London.
It was as well. People were actually quite impressed by the behaviour of the crowd. They were dead quiet. It was almost a piercing silence. And so this would have just heightened those noises all the more. Obviously, as you were saying, every regiment probably wearing a mourning band and with reversed arms. It wasn't just the rifles doing that. Every battalion had to. Muffled drums as well, which I believe is also a sign of somber reflection, because you don't want to be too loud or brassy with drum beats or anything like that. And when you visit Stratfield Say, and you go to the big barn where they now keep the funeral carriage, they play selections of some of the music that was used on the day, some of which was composed by his father, Garrett Wellesley, the Earl of Mornington. And around the wall is a big sort of concertina panorama of the regiments that were involved in the procession. And what do you think about it? It looms at you as you walk in. I wasn't quite prepared for it. You walk into this.
The scale of the wheels, for example, and where your eye height is, I thought it'd be a carriage as we kind of know it, and you'd almost step onto it if you could. I wasn't prepared for the scale that the wheels would be. And this is a personal one, of the wheels of the Quadriga statue on top of Wellington Arch. The similar height for something that's going to be put up 6 stories and needs to look impressive from a distance. It's that, but it's designed for people to see standing by the side of the road. And as you're saying, decorations. So it's got his battle honours, only a few of his many.
The famous ones.
There's some of the famous ones, but not all of them, because they couldn't all fit on there. And then real arms, armour and standards on top, which was selected, I think, from the Constable of the Tower of London, or at least from the Armoury of the Tower of London. So you've got like a captured French cuirassier helmet and cuirass breastplate on there, and pole arms and swords and so.
A cornucopia of the arms of war and things like that. You see them in old 18th century engravings where this victorious general has like a sort of a nice spread of weapons.
And laying down the arms of the tribes, and actually on the Quadriga statue, I think it's almost a nice tie-in on top of Wellington Arch. That's the chariot of war with the angel of peace, and at the back, you stand on the eastern balcony, look up, you can see the arms, armour, cannons and flags. A kind of similar theme between the two. I don't think intentional, but quite nice there. And they've actually allowed at Stratford Say, as often you have in regimental standards, in chapels, just to slowly degrade with time in that barn.
Yes, so it's really impactful. They've done a very good job of presenting it, because they also recorded his titles.
The most high, mighty, and most noble Prince Arthur, Duke and Marquis of Wellington, Marquis of Douro, Earl of Wellington, Viscount Wellington of Talavera and of Wellington, and Baron Douro of Wellesley, Knight of the most noble Order of the Garter, Knight of the Grand Cross of the most honourable Order of the Bath, one of Her Majesty's most honourable Privy Council, and Field Marshal and Commander-in-Chief of Her Majesty's Forces, born 1st of May 1769, died 14th of December 1852. That doesn't take into account all of the many offices that he held during his lifetime.
Or foreign titles he had. He had some very high orders of chivalry. And actually that leads us quite well onto the actual funeral ceremony at St. Paul's. Now, as I was saying before, there was mechanical parts built into this wagon, massive wagon, this monster wagon. And it goes up to the west door, I believe, of St. Paul's Cathedral. And unfortunately, it's meant to have a mechanism that allows it to swing the coffin onto the bier on the west door. Unfortunately, this isn't working at the moment, and it takes them about an hour to fix it before they can actually get it to work. Once they do that, the actual ceremony can begin. And inside St. Paul's Cathedral is obviously draped with captured flags and things. Obviously, Nelson's flags are in there, and he's amidst all of the great heroes of the country, and it's packed in there with obviously gallery seats have been erected inside it for everybody to sit in, and this is where they read out his immense list of titles, a snippet of which that you read out there. And this is the end. There's some nice descriptions of it about some people getting the image of a great flock of birds rising and taking rest as everybody uncovered their heads, as the coffin was presented, and then obviously they started to play funeral dirges and things like that, and sang psalms and religious music. One of which was, I believe, Man Born of Woman, and a lot of his old army friends found themselves in tears, and a lot of people were very moved, especially to see that as the coffin was lowered into the ground, the Earl of Anglesey could not stop himself reaching out and touching the coffin in a final farewell, and people could see the tears running down his cheeks. And this was the big, grand Te Deum that ended the story of the Duke of Wellington.
And then we were left after a long day, 4 hours, the procession and then the funeral on top. That was the end of the first Duke's time. We're now with a fantastic legacy, many books, much discussion and topics, but that was the end of his time. And I think the weight of those people who were fortunate enough to be in St. Paul's or line the route, it must have been weighing very heavily of them that evening when they left.
Because as they left, the minute guns would be firing from the tower in the salute. So just to add to the weight of it all.
It would have been a very strange place. I think it feels quiet now, but it would have been particularly ominous then.
And so, and then another thing you'll find, if you are lucky enough to also visit Apsley House and Stratfield, say very close to each other, as I was lucky enough to do in 2019, you'll get such an idea of the impact this man had on British public life. And when you see then the funeral carriage and the presentation of his funeral at Stratfield, say, it'll really hit you, I think, how much this not only this event, but this man affected people's lives. People grew up. Remember, he lived a very long time. He lived from 1769 to 1852. And that means a lot of people would not have known a time when he was not alive. most people would have grown up knowing the Duke of Wellington was there. He would have been in the papers an awful lot, especially after Waterloo. And so it would have been just so incredibly strange. It would have actually been like a long-reigning monarch had died. If, again, I'm going to say this again, and I'm going to say this very respectfully, but when the good Queen passes away, that will be quite similar to how these people had felt. It was the same when Queen Victoria died. Everybody was going, can you imagine? It's just so strange thinking of her not here anymore when Queen Victoria died. And it was the same for the Duke of Wellington. He was such a big part of politics and public life and the history of the country, of where the country had got to, that it was almost unthinkable to think that he was no longer going to be doing things.
I would say it was the stalwarts, of society. I think it was Queen Victoria said she couldn't basically imagine life without him. It was so strange. She'd grown up with the Duke.
Exactly.
And so ever since his last battle, his last victory at Waterloo, very soon after that, and his time then in Europe, he came back and he'd been in British politics. And that's not just to say officers in politics, that's to say the time he spent in Apsley House hosting people, dining people, the corridors of power there, as well as his office or horse guards. I think it's just as important. That's why I find the Apsley House part of the story so fascinating, of hosting people for dinner. We've got excerpts of when George IV and William came to dinner individually, and he's not even in office with. It's individually a personal advisor, and people are going to be aware of these things happening because they're going to see the royal coach. So people will be thronging outside his home, his offices, to see the Duke, and he'll be a very recognisable figure going down to work, leaving Hyde Park Corner, going to Horse Guards Parade, which is pretty much my normal walking route to work from Trafalgar Square, and he was doing it on horseback. He would be as recognisable as name a celebrity, name a movie star, insert their name here, from Brad Pitt to Tom Cruise to Prince Charles royalty. It would be as much as Charles or William walking past you in the street going to work is what would have been a daily occurrence for London.
I don't hesitate to say that there is not a non-royal public figure in recent history, I think, maybe since Thatcher or something like that, that would equate to the celebrity of this guy.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest differences, is we don't hold our politicians to the same level of celebrity. Tony Blair attempted it, but there's a deep rabbit hole. But we don't. Level of celebrity when you've got the Waterloo banquet, having generals held up as people that you would have maybe a cameo of or a silhouette of in your wall, because you've got, I really like Roland Hill, I really like Beresford, or I really like, and any of these people that you've chosen as the heroes of Waterloo, as being as big as a boy band. It's unusual. We wouldn't have it these days. We wouldn't. You could probably walk past many of the British Army's senior generals and not recognise them.
You wouldn't have a clue.
If they're out of uniform, whereas then they were the celebrities of the day, rightly or wrongly, and society's changed.
And as we said, world changed. Britain changed when the Duke of Wellington died. And this was how people processed that passing. And I think I can only end this, my part in this, by remembering that very sweet and very sad thing that the second Duke said about how, and it's sort of a wistful thing, isn't it? It's sort of a shocked thing. Imagine the Duke of Wellington being announced, and only I walk in. And now he has to walk in.
He is the Duke.
He is the Duke of Wellington. Long live the Duke of Wellington.
The Duke of Wellington. Yes.
Well, yes, exactly. There is only one the Duke of Wellington. The Duke.
The Duke. The great Duke. The
The
Iron
great
Duke.
Duke.
The conqueror of the world's conqueror.
Indeed. And so, ladies and gentlemen, with that, we thank you for watching this special episode of the All Things Wellington series. That's from me. I thank you all for watching, and I hope you will come back again and watch another one.
I think we will try to do a few more with a second lockdown coming.
We will. And therefore, once again, at this time, in these troubling times, ladies and gentlemen, I encourage you, as the Duke of Wellington would have encouraged you, to encourage amongst you the spirit of gentlemen and soldiers, to also have courage, to have compassion, and we will see you again for the next one.
Hard pounding this, gentlemen. Let's see who lasts the longest.